You're listening to the 2020 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, Our People, Our Cultures, Our Languages, features Behrouz Boochani, Resika Sapkota, Olivia Hall, and Rose Liu in conversation with Dana Wensley.
Kia hiwara, kia hiwara. Kia hiwara I tēnei tuku, kia hiwara I tērā tuku. Kei whakapuru a koe I te toto, whakapuru tōnu, whakapuru tōnu. Kāore koa koau, e kimi ana e hahau ana. E ngā piringa, e ngā kokonga, e ngā pairā piringa, hā koa koa, kā watea. No reira, ngā mihi o te ata ki a tātou I tēnei whare e manaaki nei I a tātou. Welcome to our manuhiri, and I'll hand over to Dana to conduct this interview. Thank you. Kia hiwara, kia hiwara. Kia hiwara I tēnei tuku, kia hiwara I tērā tuku. Kei whakapuru a koe I te toto, whakapuru tōnu, whakapuru tōnu. Kāore koa koau, e kimi ana e hahau ana. E ngā piringa, e ngā kokonga, e ngā pairā piringa, hā koa koa, kā watea. No reira, ngā mihi o te ata ki a tātou I tēnei whare e manaaki nei I a tātou. Welcome to our manuhiri, and I'll hand over to Dana to conduct this interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. You may know Dana, she is a Tasman District Councillor, and she's also a member of the New Zealand Society of Authors and has been for many years a representative of PEN, which is the human rights organisations for writers around the world. Thank you very much, Dana. Can you join me in giving them a round of applause?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to everyone here this morning, and thank you, Tawari, for beginning this session with a karakia. I thought it was important to do in recognition of our unique bicultural obligations in New Zealand. We've an exceptional panel in front of us today, and a real reason to celebrate the diversity we have up here on stage this morning. Our panel represents some of Aotearoa New Zealand's most impressive writers, community leaders, and young leaders of tomorrow. Today on the panel, it's with great pleasure to be joined by such a diverse range of people. I'd like to introduce, on my right, Olivia Hall. Olivia Hall is a well-known Nelsonian. Her ties to this region go back generations. She's of Ngāti Rārua descent. Olivia is an experienced trustee and director of various not-for-profit and profit-based organisations from the top of the South, as well as being an executive and an MBA graduate. Olivia's employment has included roles within education, arts and retail. So kia ora, Olivia, and welcome. Further on my right, I have Behrouz Boochani. He's a Kurdish Iranian writer, journalist, scholar, cultural advocate and filmmaker. He publishes regularly with The Guardian. He also writes features around the globe in publications such as Huffington Post, The Financial Times and the Sydney Morning Herald. His book, No Friend But the Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison, won the 2019 Victoria Prize for Literature. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to hear Behrouz Boochani last night talk, you will know that he was for 6 years a political prisoner incarcerated by the Australian government on Manus Island. So welcome, Behrouz. And I want to extend a warm welcome to Resika, who's sitting on my left here. She's representing an important youth voice this morning. Currently living in Nelson, Resika was born in Nepal, but her family is originally from Bhutan. At 16 years old, Resika has shown she's passionate about this region and is actively playing a role in a number of key organisations, such as the Nelson Youth Council, and she's co-chair on the Multicultural Youth Nelson Tasman Council. So thank you for coming, Resika. And finally, we have enormous pleasure to have Rose Liu on the panel. Rose is a Wellington-based writer. In 2018, Rose gained her Masters of Arts in Creative Writing at the International Institute of Modern Letters. She was awarded the Modern Letters Creative Non-Fiction Prize. Rose's work is published widely, and she has quickly established herself as a bold new voice of New Zealand literature. All the more impressive, Rose, for someone with an undergraduate degree, I understand, in mechatronics engineering. Her book, All Who Live on Islands, is a collection of intimate essays exploring a range of topics, including cultural and linguistic questions that migrants face in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome, Rose, to this event. Now, the topic for this Pukapuka talk is our people, our cultures, our languages. The Nelson-Tasman region has a wide diversity of people from many different backgrounds. According to a report prepared in 2018 for the Nelson Multicultural Council, after Auckland and Wellington, Nelson has the greatest proportion of first-generation immigrants in New Zealand. At present, 1 in 4 New Zealanders, residents in New Zealand, is born overseas. Nelson sits at 21% of first-generation immigrants. But if we unpack those statistics, we see that while the region has a high number of first-generation immigrants from the United Kingdom and Ireland, in contrast with national trends, it has far fewer visible minority migrants from Asia and the Pacific, and to a lesser extent from the Middle East and Africa. So my first question for the panellists this morning is this: what does diversity mean to you at this point in time in New Zealand? And if I can start off with Olivia, perhaps you might like to touch on what it means to be tangata whenua and how this has shaped your identity.
Ki te tuatahi ngā mihi atu ki a koutou, ki a koe, mō tō tūwharatanga tō tātou, hui nei, tēnā koutou. Kia ora. So, for me, some of the responsibilities and roles as tangata whenua is how we care for others. And so, when talking about diversity and talking about multicultural, there's a responsibility and a reciprocal relationship with tangata whenua or mana whenua or iwi or whānau or Māori. So that's probably not a full answer, but that's a start around my view of that role.
Thank you, Olivia. And Behrouz, do you want to comment?
Thank you very much. Actually, that returned to my experience, because I think, mostly talk about my experience as a Kurd who born in Iran. Because Iran is a country, so as probably you know, is with a dictatorship, religious dictatorship system, and established, unfortunately, based off just denying other identities in Iran, because Iran is a country with at least 7 or 8 languages, but the only language which is formal is Farsi. And the reason actually I left Iran was because of my cultural activities, to keep Kurdish language alive in my area. So that started when I was 7 years old, and I went to a school and I had to learn another language. And I never had this chance to educate and learn my language, my mother language. So when I became 18 years old, I educated myself. So I became a teacher for others but which was illegal. And so I was working mostly with the young people, just to educate them how to write in Kurdish, how to read in Kurdish. And later we found a magazine called Weria. So we work in that magazine just to educate people that how is important that they speak with their children in Kurdish language. And finally, I left Iran. So I can say that I left Iran because of my language, because of language, and because of the culture, because the system didn't recognize this diversity. So now that I'm in New Zealand, I look at New Zealand as a model. I know that New Zealand is not perfect, but I think the indigenous people in New Zealand achieved so much. So still this struggle continues, and for me is an example, is a model that I learn from. And so it's very actually relate to my experience as a Kurd. So now, but of course it's very difficult for me, just I came here to understand the different layers of the society and culture in New Zealand. But yeah, later, just continues.
Yeah. Backstage, you were telling me about, we were talking about this a little bit in detail, and you said, you gave me some statistics. I think you said there's 40 million Kurdish people, and you all live in borders between 4 different countries, and you are the indigenous people, but you don't use that term, use that phrase.
Yeah, we don't use that word, that concept, but of course we are indigenous of that land. And so 40 million population, which separated between 4 countries. And the interesting thing is that when we talk and we demand for our rights, just they label us as a separatist. So that's why even in Twitter, I remember just 3 weeks ago, I did a tweet, only for one tweet, 1,000 people attacked me on Twitter for what I said. Just I say that if we change the regime, what is your plan for the minorities in the next government? Just that, you know. So of course it's very, I think the country is behind in this field, but just we should work. But I myself actually, I believe that we should work to create a federalist system, which is not actually separation. It is a system that all of the ethnic should live together in a peace. And I think that is very basic human rights, but of course it's very difficult. So still we are at beginning.
Yes, I understand that, and I appreciate you sharing.
And just I think I should mention this, that now I'm in the Canterbury University, and I work with the Naitau Research Center there. So yeah, I think that is a huge and great achievement. I look at it in that way, to learn about Māori people and the struggle and the history of colonialism in this country.
Thank you. I want to talk to you some more about those topics, but I'm going to just swap now and go over to this side of the stage. Rose, your book, the books are in front of us here for those of you who aren't familiar with them. Your book touches on terminology to some extent, and as well as asking you what diversity means to you, I wanted to ask you, I thought you might be the panellist that might want to talk about terminology we use around immigrants and migrant and immigrant and refugee and asylum seeker and all those kind of terms and what that means and how that makes you feel when those terms are put on you. If you don't feel you can answer this, I can, take it to somebody else. But your book, it mentioned the responsibility you feel about being a writer from your particular perspective. So do you want to touch on those issues for us?
Yeah, just a thought that I had while you were talking, Behrouz, is I feel like just the concept of indigeneity is a really colonial construct, right? Like if you live somewhere and you come from somewhere, why would you apply that label for yourself? Because in the same way that I feel like Pakeha in this country get away with being invisible for so much of their lives until they're confronted by the fact that they too are immigrants, but just from a different generation. It's really interesting that we keep talking about, this label of indigeneity. Because like, if you're mana whenua, like why, I don't know why you would engage with yourself in that sort of othering way. And like same with, it's, like with diversity, it's really contextual depending on where you are and where you go. Because like here, I am definitely a ethnic minority because there's not as many Chinese people as there are Pakeha. But then if I go back to China, well, I'm Han Chinese and we're the colonial party there. So it's kind of like how you navigate that is really different. But Han Chinese are both colonizers and indigenous. So it's sort of the way that you need to think about diversity and how different ethnic groups relate to each other is really contextual. And I just had that interesting thought about, indigenous, what a Pakeha word to say, while you were talking, And again, it's kind of, I think it's really telling of what sort of voices we centre when we talk about, like you are a migrant, you are a refugee, and why do we apply these words in this way to non-white people? I think it really shows what is being centred in that conversation.
Resika, you're sitting here as the youth voice with the most intimate experience, really, of being a recent immigrant to this region. So would you like to tell us about your experience and how you have found settling into New Zealand? And I'm interested in also the fact that you said that you settled in very well with your family. So perhaps you want to tease out some things around that experience that made things go well for you.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, first of all. It's been nearly 6 years since I moved to New Zealand. And I was about 11 years old when I first came to New Zealand. And I did settle well with my family because of the help of different organizations such as Red Cross and the volunteers provided from Red Cross. And but as well as settling well, we had many struggles, such as adjusting to new culture and new country, and leaving our home country and our friends, family back in Nepal. So it was very hard when I first came to New Zealand. I was very excited because I was a little girl. I was very excited to come to a new country and explore all the amazing things this country had to offer. But as well as that, I also missed my country very much, and my family and my friends that I left behind. It was really hard to move on from there, but with the help of course, amazing people from Nelson and volunteers, we settled really well, and we felt home here because we didn't feel as an outsider. So there was so people really were approaching and involving, and they really made us feel like this was home for us. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the role youth play in that settling process, because I remember reading a report about 3 years ago, I think it was from the Nelson Multicultural Council, had commissioned it from Victoria University, and it spoke about how youth actually play an integral role in the settling process. Sometimes they have the role as translators and interpreters for their family. And that came out a little bit in the beginning of your book, Rose. It talked about how you helped with the shopping and that, you know, your grandparents, that process of settling into the country. So, do you want to expand about that and how that relationship, being the go-between, if you like, affects you as a youth growing up in New Zealand? Rose?
Yeah, I don't know if everyone's familiar with this sort of a concept of being like the 1.5 generation migrant, which is kind of how I feel, where I came here when I was 5, so I was sort of young enough that I pass like as quite Kiwi in a lot of contexts, but I still have enough sort of language that I can still communicate with my grandparents. And it's really interesting because, yeah, you do get to be that sort of like cultural bridge. And for me especially, I'm so aware of all of the ways that I can just slip into mainstream Aotearoa society in a way that my grandparents would absolutely never be able to. And it's not just a language or a cultural thing, but it's just to do with like their education and their background, and just the way that they approach living here is just so different. I have this real funny anecdote about my grandparents actually. So my family moved to Auckland last year, and so my grandparents now, they've been adjusting to this new neighbourhood, and they, they're old, so the change was a bit hard for them, and it's a different community, and so my grandparents would go for walks around the neighbourhood, and my granddad's not very fit, so he carries around a piece of cardboard, so whenever he's tired, he can just put the piece of cardboard down on the ground, and he just sits down. And so the new neighbourhood we live in has like a higher proportion of Asian people because it's in Auckland. And so my grandma was like telling me the story about her and my grandpa going for a walk, and she was like, yeah, and he'll just sit down, and sometimes people will stop and they'll check up on him because there's just this like old elderly man sitting on the side of the road, and she's like, Rose, it's always the white people that check. She's like, it's always the one. Yeah, they're friendlier. And I was like, okay. It's just like a really, but it's just another way of like, they understand things in a really different way to I do, but I'm glad that they're having a great time. Yeah.
It's a fascinating anecdote. Did you experience that role as the bridge, as Rose calls it, when you came to New Zealand?
I did. But not as much as Rose, but I did because I have a grandma and she does not speak English at all, and it was very hard for her to communicate with volunteers and others who were keen to help her, but she did not know how to speak to them, and so I was there to translate for her. And because in Nepal and in the camp that I lived, the neighborhood, we were like a family. So everyone from the neighborhood, we knew each other. We would go to the houses and stuff like that. But here, we don't do that. So it's just our house. You're just in the house. But like, I feel like for us as a youth, it's very easy to adjust. Not easy, but it's not as hard as for older people to adjust to a new culture and new country, because my grandma, she's been living her whole life in another country, and just to suddenly come to a different country and different culture and to adjust there, it's very hard for her. So, and she just does not go out, she cannot walk properly, so she can't go out of the house, so she's in the house all the time. And then so I just put some cultural stuff in the TV, and she just watches that. So I feel like it's very hard for older people, more hard for older people than as youth who can speak English and who learn. Because as a youth, we can adapt and learn things quicker. But for my grandma, she's trying, she's learning, she goes to English school, she tries to learn English, but it's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Olivia, you've come from a totally different perspective where you've got a whakapapa that stretches back in this region, and whānau is of course very important to you. So do you want to talk to us about what it means for you to be sitting here today on this panel?
I was just thinking when we're talking about language, for my own family, we hadn't had te reo in it for 4 generations. So when I started learning te reo, that was a big thing. In my own way, I was helping make some of the very similar connections. And so it's a very interesting, especially when you're talking about lots of cultures coming in, and language here has been lost by so many Māori whānau, and there's so many working very hard to bring it back. There's so many people that have held on to it and shared it, that is part of its rejuvenation. But yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting sort of comparison, that even though I'm from here and have whakapapa to here, that there is that almost, I thought how wonderful to have your language so in depth throughout your family, and still. So for me, so that was really around language. I'm not sure where my question was supposed to go.
You've led us in a different way, because I was thinking, when you were just saying that, I was thinking your connections with Behrouz are actually stronger than I thought, in terms of he was talking about learning his Kurdish language and how hard that was. That was something that you took on so that language didn't die out. And and now you've said that for 4 generations, your whānau didn't speak te reo. So, that is an interesting, really, really interesting fact that, in a way, joins you two sitting here, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is on base of my experience. I believe that all of the minorities all around the world, so this or the ethnic groups, or it can be LGBT people, women, all of these, I think we are a victim under a same mentality. And that's why I believe that all of the social movements should work together and support each other, because we, all of these minorities, doesn't matter where. So I'm talking about Iran, and you can see that how is similar to New Zealand. And everywhere around the world, we should create this network. And in terms of the indigenous people, I think now I'm working actually in this way to create a global network to support each other and also learn from each other. It's very important for example, for Kurdish people in Middle East, because we have at least 100 years of struggling against the colonial system. And that's why that created a knowledge of resistance, and that become a part of our culture. So it's very important that if we share this experience, this knowledge, for example, with Maori people, or we learn from Maori people, or from indigenous movement in Australia and in other countries. So that's why I think it's very, very important, and I am working in this way actually. And regarding the language, it's very interesting. Just recently I wrote a short story in Kurdish language, in my own language, and that is very interesting. So I publish it, but I put a dictionary in end of my short story for Kurdish people who read it. That is very interesting. Is that even in a language that I wrote, my people couldn't understand it. So they should spend so much time, because I did so much research to actually learn this language, to bring it back, at least for myself. And now I'm working in that way to educate the new generation. But the problem is that no one read it, you know? So, yeah, probably some people, but I work in this way. So hopefully, on future, so I believe that we should, so I should create this text. I should write books in this language, at least keep the language alive in the book, in the books. And on future, if we challenge the power structure and something political change, and we have this opportunity on future that people be allowed to learn Kurdish, we use those texts. So it's very, I don't know how to describe it. It's very difficult to be a Kurd in this world. That's why title of this book is No Front But the Mountains, which is a Kurdish term that, we no have front but the mountains, because mountains has a great role in our resistance. So just we are working in this way. Yeah.
And I want to bring in Rose here because I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm thinking of Rose's book, which I have to admit it was a little bit complex when I first started to read it, because it's the first book that I read that had the bilingual, it had the Mandarin written there and then the English, and I wasn't quite sure if what was in English following the Mandarin was an exact translation or what I might be missing out on. And I was actually very thankful that I found out my nephew has a girlfriend who's from Wuhan in China. I happened to be up in Auckland on Tuesday, and I had your book, and I said, hey, what does this mean? And she read it out to me and translated it, and it was actually wonderful to hear it spoken. But it was very important to you, I understand, to have those two languages sitting there and not to have the so-called foreign language in italics, which is how we normally do things in publishing. So do you want to just also talk about that and language and how important it is to you?
Yeah, and similarly to what Behrouz was saying, is for sort of people of my generation of Chinese people in New Zealand, we all have very patchy relationships with Mandarin, and obviously Mandarin is in no danger of dying. Because more than 1 billion Mandarin speakers, so it's a very, the language is in a very different state. But I think there's still the feelings of it's really hard to access a different language when you live in a predominantly English-speaking place, and a lot of sort of people who grew up here that don't look Pākehā, there's a lot of shame in speaking your other languages, so there's still a lot to unpack there as well. But so I was also really conscious when I was writing my book, where I think my primary audience is sort of people of my generation, but I probably do have better Mandarin than the average Chinese New Zealander here, because I've really tried quite hard to hang on to that. And so there are things in there that I'm I actually don't know if even a Chinese person who grew up in New Zealand, I don't know if they could read that. And again, with what Behrouz was saying, is the dialect that my grandparents speak, which is the dialect of Chongming, which is an island off the coast of Shanghai, and it has maybe 800,000 residents, so it's a tiny city in China. It's not even a city. It's it'd be like Martin. It'll be it's equivalent of Martin, but it's 800,000 people. Yeah, and so that language is really heavily dying as well, because there was in Chinese history as part of the Cultural Revolution, one of the things that they did was standardize the dialects. So before that, if you lived in Shanghai and you tried to talk to someone in Beijing, like no one could understand each other. And so as part of the Cultural Revolution, they standardized Mandarin. They call it Standard Mandarin, and that is what is taught to everyone in the school system now. So in China, it's really common to have the grandparents speak the dialect, and then the parent generation, they would have grown up with the dialect, but they would have learnt Mandarin in school. But then even my generation of Chinese people in China, lots of them don't have access to their grandparents' language either, because like through all the entire school system, they're just taught Mandarin. And so I knew that there were so few people around the world that spoke the dialect that my grandparents did. And so for me, it was also really important to be able to sort of put that down in paper and publish it, because there would just be so few records of that. Yeah. And it was hard because, I worked with an editor at VUP, and they were like, we can't help you with the Mandarin or the Sominghua, like you need to sort that out yourself. So like my Mandarin teacher helped me proof all the Mandarin text. And then the transliteration that I had found for my grandparents' language, it was just like a random translate that a language preservation society had published. And I remember I tried to access it recently and their webpage is down. So it's like little stuff like that where you're like, oh, it's actually really hard to hang on to these things, and we think they're going to remain, but they kind of slip out. And then once they're off the internet, I'm like, oh, I can't access it anymore.
Yes, yeah. It was a really fascinating part of your book, and I think in the first 3 pages you mentioned that there's 3 generations in your family and you all speak different languages, and that just really sets the scene for the whole book in a way. Just this conversation that's happening throughout your book in terms of you and your relationship to Aotearoa and your parents and fitting in. So it was a really wonderful way to do it. I want to ask the panel now, because we're talking about language and how important it is to culture and belonging and identity, if you would like to say something in your first language, just a few sentences so that the audience can hear it and share the richness of that language. Behrouz, would you like to start?
It's very difficult, but I think, so this language that I'm talking about, actually Kurdish language is alive and is developed enough. But I'm talking about a particular accent, because Kurdish has at least 4 accents. So in other accents, like we have Sorani, Kermanji, they had this opportunity because we are facing 4 central governments. So in other parts of in Iraq, so in north of Iran, now Kurdish people that have their own state. So other accents now is developed enough in even the philosophy books, is available. They translate the biggest philosophers' book. I'm talking about a particular accent, so it's very difficult because I'm not...
I don't want to put you on the spot. If you want to share something, I'm sure the audience would love to hear, but it's a chance. So take it.
It's really difficult.
Okay.
Just
Well, I'll tell you what, I did a radio show once for you when I was doing my PEN segments. PEN is an international human rights organisation that represents writers around the world that are imprisoned for their work. And I Googled you, and there's a beautiful piece on YouTube of you from Manus Island actually singing a song in your native dialect. So if anybody is interested, you can listen to that because it is a wonderful language and it is worthwhile. It's worthwhile hearing. Olivia, would you like to? You've already introduced yourself, but
absolutely, and I'm sure I'd be amazed if there's nobody in the room that has ever not heard Te Reo before, and especially because you've already heard it today. So I suppose I just wanted to, and I've already admitted it wasn't my first language. My first language was English, and Te Reo was a journey I'm forever on. that I'm moving through. But there is something, I think, about people speaking from the language of their heart. And, you know, when they're connecting with their heritage and what that means to them, there's a very different sense you get and a very different connection, even if you can't understand them. And I think that's nice when lots of cultures come together and actually you just enjoy somebody speaking in their language or singing in their language, because there's a lot more there's a meaning and there's a connection to people and place that comes out in their languaging. So yes, I've already introduced myself, so
Thank you. Resika?
सबैजना नमस्ते, मेरो नाम रसिका हो अनि म चाहिँ अहिले यहाँनिर गर्ल्स कलेजमा पढिरहेको छु। म नेपालमा जन्मेको थिएँ अनि म यहाँ तपाईँहरूको बिचमा आएर यसरी बोल्नुको लागि मलाई धेरै खुसी लागिरहेको छ। धन्यवाद।
Yeah, Mandarin's pretty common as well. But if anyone speaks Mandarin, I'm always happy to practice. But 大家好，我叫陆阳怡我的老家是上海，我从崇明岛我在崇明岛出生，我是1995年来新西兰，很高兴认识你。
Behrouz, sorry for putting you on the spot there. I want to talk about your book right now. Because when I read your book, I was struck by the language in it. It's been described as a fusion of styles, part creative writing, part poetry, part prose, part journalism, and part strategic resistance. And you're quoted as saying, "For a long time, I tried to describe the situation on Manus Island, to describe the life in the Manus prison camp. But I think that the journalism language doesn't have the capacity to describe this life and the suffering and how the system is working here." So I want to ask you, because there's so much poetry in your book as well, what you think there is special about poetry that has the ability to work across cultures and transcend boundaries and to really express what you wanted to say in the book?
Yeah, and I think I should mention I wrote this book in Farsi because on that circumstances I really didn't have access to translator, so that's why I wrote it in Farsi. So in Farsi language, actually, in Middle East, you know, in Arabic, Kurdish, there is these languages are very poetic, and actually I think the main part of the culture in Iran is poetry. And so the language is very poetic. It is like a tradition. So even, so in Australia, mostly people know me as a poet, but I myself, I don't recognize myself as a poet. And I think in Iran, people don't recognize me as a poet too, because we have very big poets. And I think that is very interesting, that when I write in English, people say, oh, Behrouz is a poet. But in Iran, people really don't recognize me as a poet. Yeah. So that is very interesting. So that's why in this book, it was unavoidable. So when I write, it's really difficult. And I always struggle to don't write in a poetic language, because I believe that so poetry has a particular language, so it is a different form of language, and writing novel is a different one. So I'm struggling to don't write in poetic language, but in any way that I write, even the political article, there is a layer of poetry in. So yeah, I am struggling actually to don't do that. But so in this book, of course, I think there are about 70 poems. Yeah, but I myself don't recognize them as a poem.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting.
Yeah.
Because the work I do for PEN, 14% of the writers that we represent around the world do identify as being poets, and there is a link between poetry and political activism, and it fascinates me. And now you've just said that you don't identify as a poet. It's just something that comes, that that's
But it
how
was
you
necessary.
express.
Yeah,
It's,
you know. Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a link.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a
Actually, I
link.
wanted to challenge the. Of course, when I was there, I think I published more than 100 opinion piece in mostly in Guardian. So, but I always I struggled to create my own language, a language to be free of journalism, which is not superficial, it's very limited language, and a language that be free of power structure. So I wanted to create my own language, my own concept to represent our situation. So that's why this book, yes, some people say it is a novel, some people is not, no, it's not a novel, it's poetry, some people say it's journalism, some people say it's biography, so it's everything and nothing. Yeah.
And for the audience, I don't know how many of you are here that were there last night, but the process of creation, of course, as you say, it was written in snippets on WhatsApp and came out and was translated, wasn't it, by somebody in Australia into the English that it is in there today in front of you for us all to read. And that must have just been an experience to write. You wrote it on your phone. You smuggled a phone into the camp, and I think I recall you saying that were your phones confiscated at times? So I want to ask you, you took that role on yourself to be the voice of Manus Island, a detention camp, really. And was that something that you just felt you had to do? Were you driven to do that?
Yeah, I think, the first day that I found myself in that place, so I was just banished and I saw myself in a remote prison. I believe that it is like a mission or is like a duty for a journalist, to a writer, to expose that system. So at the first day, I started to really find a way to communicate with the world. But regarding the writing the book in WhatsApp, the media really like to create like a drama around this, and people find it very incredible. But for me, it's very simple that you're writing. But I think it's not important that I wrote this book on WhatsApp or not. I have a poetic imagination about this, that these words that I wrote in that island, I wrote them and sent them text by text to Australia, and these words were flying to Australia, and in Australia get together and became a book, and they put my photo on the book, and it's everywhere just looking at people. So in the parliament, in the book stores, everywhere in Australia, and I never been in Australia. But this book is everywhere, and just look straight at people of Australia, of the politicians, and that created a huge, I think, challenge. I look at it in this way, and just that is interesting. I should share that many people of Australia they bought this book and they posted to the parliament. to the Prime Minister, all of the like senators, and just they were, some of them, they said, please stop, don't send this book to us. And it's very interesting, in that system, they never recognize that someone like me exists. You know, I mean that even when I came to New Zealand, when this book was everywhere, and I remember before the election, federal election, so I think I did about 100 events in 1 year. So I was everywhere, and I was telling people, sharing this story. And even when I came here, when they asked the immigration minister, he said, oh, this individual person, they call me individual, even because they didn't want to recognize this. And they never mentioned my name. They never said Behrouz. But I exist, and I exist, and they are aware of that.
Yes.
Yeah, and this book exists in Australia.
Yeah, it is fascinating because I think you were picked up by the Australian Navy and taken to Manus Island, and so now it is fascinating that now your book is all over Australia, a country that you were
actually it's
denied
everywhere.
access to, all over, but
no, in the
Australia.
world, it's published in 25 countries. So that is, I think, yeah. So, but my publisher around the world, they posted this book to Australian embassies everywhere. So it's just, I told them, not myself, but I say that we refugees in Manus Island, Nauru, that you detain us for many years, we will chase you forever because you. Because you cannot deny this part of your history. Because we created work, we challenge you through art, literature, and we created the knowledge. And that is our resistance. Yeah, so at beginning, they say that these people are terrorists, they are dangerous, they are drug dealers, so we should banish them. But in end of the story, we challenge them in this way. So now I think people can judge who is terrorist or... Yeah, I look at it in this way.
It does show the power of writing, and I want to go now and talk to Rose a little bit, because in your book you talk about growing up and how important books were to you, but not finding people that represented you in the books that you were reading. And then when it came to you writing this book, there's a quote that you said, talking about the feeling of the weight of representing your culture. You say, my Pākehā contemporaries were free to write without the millstone of, but is this authentic, representative, good for Black, Asian, Latino, Native people hanging around their necks. And so you describe that burden in a way of being a writer from a minority group and feeling that you can't just write from your heart, you're also carrying a weight of a culture behind you. So can you explain more about that and how it felt as a child growing up not being able to read about people like you, but also then as an author writing from that particular perspective?
I just should clarify that quote is me quoting Jenny Zhang, who is a Chinese American writer who I really love, and obviously I included that quote because it was very resonant. And yeah, I guess like a lot of my friends are authors, as you would expect, and I think sometimes I am struck by, like, there are just things that I feel like I couldn't do because I will always be the Chinese New Zealand author, and me and Branavan Gangalingam are doing a workshop for the Kapiti Writers Retreat in February, and the topic that we've settled on is like writing the ordinary, because I guess something that we were talking about was like, what do you consider ordinary in literature? Like, if you take a book like Normal People, the normal people are like white Irish people who are like middle class, well, upper class and lower class, but you know, it's a very specific experience. They go to a very fancy school and they, you know, talk about politics and drink their coffees, and like, this is normal people. And same with like, I was talking at another event about like writing. Someone asked about like, you know, like, why do we always write about big things? What about writing the ordinary and writing the everyday? And my response was like, my entire book is the everyday. I talk about family, I talk about domesticity, I talk about my grandparents, I talk about people just pottering around at home doing things that are completely ordinary for me and my family. But then because of who I am in this sort of context, it's just like, oh, that's not normal at all. Like, this is a Chinese story about Chinese people in New Zealand. And so it's like, as a writer, I definitely feel that tension of like, yes, on the one hand, I understand that this is like an angle that so many other Chinese New Zealanders or other sort of like othered people have been missing, and they don't, you know, they can see themselves in my book in a way that they don't feel like they can see in themselves in other books. But it is really interesting that I feel like I talk about the ordinary, but other people don't, and that's sort of that disconnect between how I view my work and how other people view my work. And then it's kind of thinking about next books and stuff. Like, I feel like it's kind of this inescapable thing of this tension between how I want to be read and how I will be read. Yeah.
It's very, very interesting. And when I was reading it, I actually was looking at Heroa through your eyes, and I just thought that was, it showed up things for me that I wasn't aware that I had internalized, and it made me reflect on myself and my culture. There's just some funny bits throughout your book that, you know, I really encourage people to read it. You talk about your father always being the hustler and the kind of role he takes on in the family, and you talk about your grandma, I think it is, asking if you're going to the poor man's store or the rich man's store, meaning Pack and Save or New World. And you know, my husband's family is from Trinidad, and to be honest, he always goes to Pack and Save, and I always go to New World, and I'd never really, I'd never thought of it until that point, and I was just thinking, oh my God, this is like, you know, I'm understanding myself through reading your book. So, Olivia, let's turn to you now. I had some questions for you that I wanted to ask about what it meant to you to be from Ngāti Rārua, and particularly in relation to the wonderful dress that you designed for the world of wearable art. And because that was really an amazing dress, and it went on to be showcased in America, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So I had a previous life doing artwork, and atua Māori, wahine Māori, female gods always, in Māori culture, always really resonated me, and all these wonderful stories about these amazing women were always my inspiration. And I'm lucky enough to also be inspired by real wahine toa, so real strong women that are in my life as well. But yes, they always, everyone knows about Māui, and everyone, so just for me, taking some of that more patriarchal view of our culture has always inspired me. The other thing was around that outfit was also telling a story, like every other people here, telling a story that was being told by a non-Māori voice. So there were a number of outfits that were put through well that had some cultural things that were missing. There were, and some of them were quite upsetting as Māori. When you see tiki on a pair of bikini bottoms, it's really upsetting, and also weird things like mohawks and things like this are sort of, well, that's ethnic, so we'll just kind of bunch them all together into this thing that's a curiosity, really. And so really wanted to tell a narrative about Māori that wasn't being told in that space. And it evolved. I had a period of time where I had a young child and was at home and finishing off some studies and wanted to do something creative. So it just kind of grew in the corner of the lounge and had to be redone a number of times. Had a number of cup of coffees dropped on it and things like that. But it was really around telling that narrative. There were powerful and amazing stories, and not minimised down to these tiny little weird motifs used in weird ways, that wanted to have a power of some of the stories and some of the people that have inspired me.
Mm-hmm. And you've touched on the issue of cultural appropriation in a way, haven't you, there? So do you want to say more about that, or does anybody else want to comment on cultural appropriation? Or are we going to avoid that topic? It is an issue, because we want to make sure that it's your story that's getting out. We want to make sure that the narrative is your own and that you own it. And that's not always the case, is it? It doesn't always happen that way.
I think there's something around, if it's not seen in the normal. If it's not seen in the normal, it's assumed it's not happening. But in the and when you're talking about poetry of language, te reo was resonated so strongly. The explaining things, relationships with mountains, all these sort of things just have, and I think because it's not understood or not seen, there's just this presumption. It doesn't happen, so other people feel a responsibility to bring it, so it's seen in the spaces where they're seeing it. And so it's an interesting, and that creates interesting. I'm looking at Rose, thinking she might have something to say here.
About cultural appropriation? Yeah, I think it's a really hard line, because I think it's great for people to be able to appreciate other cultures, and like you do need to like participate in those experiences in some way. And for me, it kind of like comes down to like, if someone makes money from it, that's when I'm like, oh, I don't really like this. Like, I feel like like fashion designers that just take like a Māori motif and then like jack up the prices, and it's just like, well, you're not really giving this money back. You're not really helping in any way. You kind of just want to make a quick buck. And like same with like Wellington has a lot of Asian fusion restaurants all by white people, and the food is horrendous. And I'm like, you can't have an Asian restaurant. Like that doesn't even make sense. Like, you know, like that is like so many different countries' cuisines. You can't put like momos and curries on, well, maybe momos and curries, but you know, like there's things that you shouldn't just like mix and match just because they're from the same continent. And I think it's really, cultural appropriation really comes down with how deeply you engage with the topic and like what your intentions are. Because I definitely think people should learn and embrace other cultures, and there will be times where you fuck up, and that's totally okay. And I think people should support people on those journeys. But yeah, I think for me the hard line is, are you making money off this? That's not good. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything? Don't have to.
No, I think Rose covered it pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're going to have some questions from the floor in a few minutes, but before we do, I want to ask one question of the panellists, because we've discussed so many topics here this morning, and they're so important in terms of diversity and culture and how we've got to move forward as a nation. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we had a general election last week, and Behrouz, you said last night, I think, that this was the first general election that was democratic that you've been witnessed, and that was just, to me, an amazing thing for me to hear. So I want to ask the panellists if you would, if you've got any ideas about how we create better outcomes for future generations to be good ancestors. And Olivia, I'll start with you.
I think it just comes responsibility. I agree with Rose about, the sharing of culture and the sharing of multiple cultures, multiple voices, creating spaces where multiple voices have a space to be heard. Since we're talking politics, I'm far on the side of Māori Party creating that voice in there. And it not to be, obviously it's not the only voice, but it needs to, that's a unique voice that for me is very important, that it's there, that it's heard, that there is that space. And it's not given, permission isn't asked for it, but it's there.
I think if I talk about New Zealand, so I say I'm very new about New Zealand, but I think it's very important that this generation, we transfer the experience, and also we learn from history, we teach history, we educate history, and we acknowledge history. So that is very important. And in Australia, unfortunately, the education system, or I say that the history has two parts. Is official history and unofficial history, that I call it history from below to up. And I think I am someone like me and people like me, we are representing the dark part of the history and which exists, but the official history doesn't recognize that. And if you look at Australia, the image that Australia produced and exported to the world is that Australia is a country which many beaches and white girls are in the beach and just they are lying down. That is the image of Australia, which is a very, beautiful, but that is not true. That is not true. So the history of Australia is different. But regarding New Zealand, actually I don't know, so just I'm learning. But I think it's very important for New Zealand that we read and we learn and acknowledge the history. That how, it's very important that the new generation know that what's happened in this country and how we reach to this stage that now it's very important for New Zealand. And I think, New Zealand will achieve more. If we really teach. I know that history is very different when I talk about the history. So in a country like Iran, history is very ancient history. But in New Zealand, the modern history is very important. The struggle of indigenous people, the struggle of Māori and what's happening in this country, what your ancestor did. And I think that is very important.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Because there's still a long way to go. There's still
Definitely,
health inequalities. There's still massive differences between Māori and Pākehā in terms of outlook and
I think there is something there around the history that there were so many layers on why so many of us don't have te reo anymore, why there is the amount of laws that were put in place to stop Māori thriving were phenomenal. And that wasn't the history we were taught growing up. Like, the history isn't taught even, and there's great movements by Ministry of Education at the moment to start getting those stories into schools. And so there's this sort of great hope for the next generation coming in, because you already see all the tamariki, all these little kids, no matter what nationality they are in New Zealand, if they go to an early childhood, they all know a heap of Māori words. And so they go home, and so te reo's getting out there, and it's that's really great. But this history is also this next bit, that it's not a cute, nice to know the te reo, but we don't actually want to engage with all of that history because it is uncomfortable. But if we can all stay in that uncomfortable space and understand it, then it gives an insight. It gives an insight to where we are today and how we make sure we're very conscious of where we're going and what we all need to do. Yeah.
And Resika and Rose, I'll pose the same question to you about what you think we can do to create better outcomes for future generations. So, Resika.
I totally agree with both of you guys. I think it's really important to reinforce the history to especially youths like me. I mean, like, not just the history of New Zealand, but also the history of where you come from. So for me, I come from Nepal and Bhutan. So I think it's really important that we learn the history of where we belong from so we can adapt to the new history of new countries. So I think it's really important to still know your culture and know the languages. So for me and my community, there are like so many youths who cannot write in my language, who have forgotten to write, or some kids who have forgotten to speak in Nepalese. So I feel like seeing that, even as a youth, seeing that really breaks my heart, because that's our culture, and language really identifies a person. So forgetting the language or forgetting your culture and learning new culture is a good thing, but as well as not forgetting your old culture or your belonging is really important as a youth as well.
Very cool.
Yeah. Solve racism. Yeah, I think it's really important. I feel like New Zealand, in the time that I have been conscious about politics and how the world works, it has really come a long way. Like, I think even globally, like, I think people are like talking a lot more about identity and indigeneity and diversity, and I think that we have much more of a collective language around these issues now than even just like 10 years ago. But I think something that I still see a lot is people sort of know that it's something that they should do, but they don't know how to do it, and they're not comfortable with what needs to change for that to actually happen. And so, like, I think if you think about, the new cohort of MPs is some of the most diverse cohort that we've had coming into Parliament for a really long time, which is really great. And that's that structural change that I think really just needs to come in everywhere, because it is still just predominantly Pākehā in decision-making capabilities and like the way that we structure, like, even just like Parliament and the court system, like that's inherited from England, like it's so much of this country is still really structurally that way, and we need to change those things. And I guess it's really interesting sort of, I guess I get these times where I'm like, oh, I have been given a seat at the table, and then you sort of look into this decision-making process, and you're like the only non-white person there, and it's just still like quite bizarre. I think that we still need to build that capability, and it's not just about like, oh, well, we just need like one Asian, one Māori, one blah, 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 and you just tick it off. Like, it's not how it works. And like, I'm not that representative of Asian people. Like, it's, you know, and it's, I think it's interesting the way that you kind of need to be a particular type of person to be even invited into those spaces. And that, I think that rules out a lot of other perspectives. Yeah.
I want to thank the panel for being so open and honest this morning, because we've just had an exceptional insight into their experiences, and I really do value you being here and putting yourself and intensely personal experiences on the line for us, because I have learnt a lot from it, and I'm sure the audience has as well. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Kerry has got the microphone and is going to...
I'm going to explain. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, we don't have a roving mic because we've already got 5 radio mics on the stage. So there's 2 things we can do. If you can get out easily and come down and ask your question here at the mic, that would be great. And if you can't, you could yell out your question. And Dana, perhaps you can repeat the question?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just pop your hand up if you want to ask one from where you're sitting. Yeah.
So the question for the panel was how we bring the elders into the conversation and make their voices heard. I understand there's a degree of social isolation that's being experienced. And I guess comments around whose role that is and how we can make that happen, because we've heard about the burdens of the youth of being that bridge. What else could we do to make it better for that generation?
Well, I think like language, like you can communicate without languages. So I think it's about maybe like finding something that they know that they can share. Like if they have like a particular craft, a particular food, or a particular thing that is like dear to them, where they are the expert. Because I feel like also, like, you know, when I think you should make them the expert, because especially if you come from a different culture, I think if you don't speak the language, people just think you're stupid, even though you're not. And so I think it's really good to sort of empower them and be like, well, we, you know, give them the space and be like, what can you teach us that we don't know? Yeah.
I would like to add to that. So I think like I really agree with that. When I first came here, I knew I knew English, but like it was really hard for me to go out there and make friends with Kiwi people, obviously, because I felt like I was not good enough to be their friend, and then I felt like they were not as open in schools as like so, but they were really friendly and stuff, but like I feel like it would be better if they approached me, because I was really shy. I was not this confident before, so I was really shy to approach them first. So I think like if they approached me first, I feel like I would have more friends. And for older people, my grandma, especially my grandma, she because she has been getting involved in the neighborhood and all that. And like being isolated here, she doesn't like that. She doesn't like being isolated in the house. She always complains like I want to go there, I want to go there. There aren't many Nepali people here. I want to communicate with them, I want to go out. And like I feel like the isolation is like a not good thing for my grandma. And so just like involving older people into the community, even though they don't know how to speak English, we have many translators and interpreters here available for them. So I feel like involving them in the community and the decisions that community makes is very important. Yeah.
That's a good point. And actually, I want to talk to that too, because as a councillor for Tasman District Council, I'm always trying to advocate around how we build our spaces and build our communities, and trying to advocate for community centres that allow intergenerational mixing and not separate people. And so much about how we design our communities is important to what happens in them. And there's something called incidental social cohesion that happens when people just rub up against each other. They just meet each other because they're out in the community. And I hear, the intergenerational mixing, the cross-cultural mixing. We've got a real need for it because there's isolation in many pockets of our society, and it's not good. So thank you for raising that topic. It is an important one. I think we've got time for one more question.
There's somebody here, and then we'll bring you up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. My name is Anna Collins, and I'm an English teacher. I work teaching ESOL students from a Bhutanese background. Most of my students lived in Nepal for many years. And my question was actually for Behrouz. We were talking about history and the history of the Kurdish people. And in Iran, prior to the revolution in 1979, what was the status of the Kurdish people and language? Were they allowed to speak or study in Kurdish language under the Shah, under the Pahlavi reign?
Yeah, actually, those people who attacked me, they were fan of Pahlavi, that I mentioned them. So, Iran as a country, so, 100 years ago, so it was a country that actually it was quite like a traditional federation. So each area had it was like a feudalism, that each area had control of itself. But Shah, the Pahlavi, when they, I'm talking about the modern life, they established Iran on base of one nation, on base of this political theory, one nation, one language. So they established Iran, the modern Iran, on base of this, and it was a project that still continues. But after 100 years, now we see that all of the ethnics are actually challenging this system, because Iran is not a country which is with only one language and one nation. So actually Pahlavi that you are talking about, they were same as this religious system. So nothing changed. Yeah.
So the Kurdish language was still repressed?
Yeah. That's why I'm here.
I'd now like to invite Kay up to the stage, who's going to say, not quite a question, say a few words, and she has a gift for you, the panellists. So please, welcome Kay.
Thank you very much to the panelists and everybody here. I just, on behalf of Sikita Project, I'm Kay Snedon. And I just want to answer that question about the elderly. So Sikita Project was established in 2010 to help the Kayan women, originally from Burma, from Kaya state of Burma, and because they were ethnic minorities, so they were kind of threatened to be tortured and killed by the junta government. And so they fled 8 years ago in the 70s, they fled their state and walked for miles in the jungle to go to Thailand, in the north of Thailand, and try to find the freedom. But what happened was those people stuck in the refugee camp in the northern Thailand for almost 20 years. And they, because they wore neck rings as you can see, and they were called a giraffe woman. So they were used as a human zoo to attract tourists, to help some business people. Anyway, but in good news is in 2010, United Nations High Commissions for Refugees and the government of New Zealand accept them, the first family of Kayan people, to come to resettle in Nelson. And after that, there are more families to come. So Sukita Project help those older women. Actually, we have 3 generations of weavers to weave using their traditional loom, we call backstrap loom, to weave using the cotton thread. And to weave these scarves that we, the Suter Kylie, been supporting of our project and help to sell our scarves here. And this is the success of Nelson. It's not just the success of our group, but it's success of refugee services and English language partners, Nelson Multicultural Council, and many volunteers that help to integrate these people into our community. And we have many, many groups of refugees. And this is what the success of our community should be. And thank you very much. Yeah,
thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank
Well, thank you once again to the panellists and to the audience. And I would just like to invite Tiwari to come up and lead us in a karakia.
Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou. Me inoi tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. Kia hiia ki ana te ātākura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.